Hey guys, tonight we delve into the rather unappetizing world of medieval dining, specifically exploring why food, frankly, sucked back then. Imagine for a moment, you're not nestled in your comfortable bed, but huddled in a dim, smoky hut. The air is thick with the smell of damp earth, and something vaguely unsettling charring over a struggling fire. Your stomach rumbles, not with the anticipation of a delicious meal, but with the dull ache of persistent, gnawing hunger, a hunger that tomorrow's feast of gritty bread and weak ale will barely pacify. It's a culinary landscape so bleak you probably wouldn't survive the entree, let alone make it to dessert, if dessert even existed beyond a slightly less sour berry. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd also love to see where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Drop it in the comments below. It's always fascinating to see our little community spread across the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your world, in these medieval times, revolves around one central, overwhelmingly dominant foodstuff: bread. It's not the crusty artisan loaf you might pick up from a fancy bakery, nor the soft, pillowy slices you'd use for a sandwich. No, this is a different beast entirely. This is the very foundation of your diet, the bulk of almost every meal, the calories that get you, just about, from sunrise to sunset. For most people, perhaps 70, even 80% of everything they eat in a day is bread. It's breakfast, lunch, and dinner. It's the snack, the sustenance, the everything. You wake up to it and you go to bed, your belly full of its heavy, often unyielding presence. Now, if you're fortunate, born into a life of some comfort, your bread might be made from wheat, finely sieved, resulting in something vaguely whitish, perhaps even a little lighter in texture. But for the vast majority, for you, tilling the fields or mucking out the stables, your bread is a darker, sadder affair. It's crafted from whatever grains are cheap and available: rye, barley, oats, sometimes even ground peas or beans in times of true desperation. This is Maslin bread, a jumble of grains, each contributing its own unique character and often unique problems. Rye, for instance, while hearty, could bring with it the dreaded St. Anthony's fire or ergotism, a horrific condition caused by a fungus that could lead to hallucinations, gangrene, and a truly agonizing end. Not exactly a wellness loaf. The journey from grain to loaf is fraught with peril. Your grain is taken to the local mill, a place often viewed with deep suspicion. The miller, a figure of much medieval scorn, had a reputation for, shall we say, creative accounting with your precious harvest. He might take too much as his share, or worse, bulk out your flour with less savory additions. Think chalk dust to whiten it, sawdust to increase its volume, or even fine sand and dirt that just happened to get swept into the mix. The grinding stones themselves, huge, heavy millstones, would inevitably chip and wear, shedding tiny fragments of rock into the flour. So when you bite into your daily bread, that sudden tooth-jarring crunch, that's not an artisanal seed blend, that's a bit of the millstone, your own personal rock supplement. Dentists, had they existed in any recognizable form, would have had a field day, or rather, a lifetime of unrelenting work. Once this dubious flour makes it back to your village, or perhaps your own less than spotless hearth, the baking process begins. Yeast as we know it is a luxury. More likely you're relying on a sourdough starter, jealously guarded and prone to its own temperamental moods, or simply the wild yeasts in the air, which could result in a bread that barely rose at all. Ovens are another hurdle. Wealthy households might have their own, but for many, it's the communal village oven. used infrequently to save precious fuel, meaning your bread might be several days old by the time you get to the end of the loaf, assuming it lasts that long. If you're baking at home over an open fire, temperature control is a guessing game. The outside is often charred black, a carbonized shield, while the inside remains stubbornly doughy and damp. A delightful combination, wouldn't you agree? So let's talk about the sensory experience. You pick up your piece of bread. It's heavy, dense as a cannonball. The color is a dull, unappetizing brown or gray. The texture under your fingers is coarse, almost abrasive. You bring it to your mouth, and the smell is, well, it's bready, but often with an undercurrent of sourness or a faintly musty aroma, depending on its age and the quality of the grain. Then, the bite. It's tough. Your jaw works hard. Your teeth grind, sometimes against those aforementioned bits of grit or stone. The flavor is bland, perhaps a little earthy, a little tangy from the starter, but mostly it's just filling. It's the food of necessity, not pleasure. You might even find yourself using a particularly stale slice, a real trencher as they called it, as an impromptu plate. You'd pile your other meager food upon it, and by the end of the meal, the bread plate would have soaked up any juices, at which point you'd either eat it yourself if you were still hungry, and you always were, or perhaps toss it to the dogs or a waiting beggar. One man's stale plate is another man's slightly less stale meal. Historians still argue whether the common folk truly grew accustomed to this gritty, often contaminated bread, or if it was a source of constant low-level digestive distress and dental wear. The evidence in skeletal remains suggests the latter, with teeth often worn down significantly by early adulthood. Sometimes, particularly for animals or in times of dire famine, a concoction known as horse bread was made, full of bran, beans, and other cheap fillers. It was dense and barely palatable, but even desperate humans were sometimes reduced to eating it. So much for your daily bread. It's a constant, often unpleasant reminder of how hard life is. A far cry from the comforting staple we know today. Forget artisan. This is a lesson in survival. Now, after all that rather joyless talk of your daily gritty bread, you're probably dreaming of something a bit more substantial. Something with a bit more chew. Meat. The very word in medieval times conjured images of feasts, of luxury, of a satisfied belly in a way that bread, however essential, never could. But here's the rub. For most people, you included, finding good meat, or indeed any meat, was a rare and often risky proposition. It was the diamond in the roughage of your diet. While the wealthy might complain if their roasted swan wasn't presented with enough theatricality, your concerns were far more fundamental, like whether you'd see meat on your trencher more than a few times a month, if that. For the common person, the primary source of meat was pork. Pigs were relatively easy to keep. They were the medieval equivalent of a walking recycling unit, happy to consume scraps and forage for themselves in the woods, if you had rights to let them. The autumn pig-killing season was a crucial time of year. This wasn't just a meal, it was an investment. That pig wasn't just bringing home the bacon. It was the bacon, the ham, the sausages, the pickled feet, and the hopes for a slightly less hungry winter. Every single part of the animal was used, nose to tail, quite literally. Nothing was wasted. Blood was used for black pudding, intestines for sausage casings. Even the bladder could be cleaned and used for storage. The concept of offal, or umbles as they were sometimes called, wasn't something to be turned up your nose at. It was vital protein. In fact, the term humble pie is thought to derive from humble pie, a pie made from the offal of an animal, often deer, which was given to the lower-ranking members of a hunting party or household. Beef was less common for the average person. Cattle were more valuable for their milk, and as draft animals for plowing your miserable rock-strewn fields. To slaughter a cow was to sacrifice a significant agricultural asset. Mutton and lamb were available, particularly in sheep-rearing areas, but again, wool often came first. Chickens and other poultry were around, scratching in the dirt, but eggs were often a more consistent and valuable product than the bird itself, unless it was an old hen past its laying days. Then it might find its way into the pot, probably requiring hours of boiling to become even remotely chewable. You'd be gnawing on that drumstick for a while. Wild game, there's the dream. Forests teemed with deer, wild boar, rabbits, and game birds. But for you, the peasant, these were largely off-limits. The mainstream historical fact here is the existence of strict forest laws. Large swaths of land were designated as royal forests or belonged to the nobility, and hunting in them was exclusively their privilege. Poaching was a serious offense with severe penalties ranging from hefty fines, which you couldn't pay, to mutilation, like losing a hand, making farming a tad difficult, or even death. So, that plump deer you see darting through the trees? Admire it from afar, my friend, unless you're feeling exceptionally brave or exceptionally foolish. Historians still argue whether the tight control over hunting rights truly kept the peasantry's meat consumption to an absolute minimum, or if a subtle clandestine network of poaching allowed for a risky but occasional taste of forbidden flesh. It's a tough call, because successful poaching, by its very nature, doesn't leave many written records, does it? The quality of meat, even when you could get it, was another major hurdle. There's no refrigeration, remember? Meat spoils, quickly. In warmer months, a freshly slaughtered animal had to be cooked and eaten almost immediately, or preserved. This meant salting was your best friend, or rather your palate's persistent overpowering acquaintance. Large quantities of salt were rubbed into the meat, drawing out moisture and making it inhospitable to bacteria. The result was incredibly salty, often tough, and a far cry from a tender, juicy steak. Smoking was another common method, imparting a strong flavor and further drying the meat. Sometimes meat was powdered, meaning it was preserved in saltpeter, giving it a reddish tinge. If the meat was a bit past its prime, shall we say, a little bit on the fragrant side, its character might be disguised with what few strong herbs or spices, if any, were available. Then there were the butchers, not exactly paragons of hygiene or honesty. Often animals were slaughtered in the street, amidst the mud and muck, the blood running into the gutters alongside other, less savory liquids. The concept of food safety was rudimentary at best. A butcher might try to pass off old meat as fresh, or meat from a diseased animal. There was little in the way of regulation, and what existed was often difficult to enforce. His motto might as well have been, "What the eye doesn't see, and the nose can be convinced to ignore, the stomach might just revolt against later." It was a gamble every time. Sometimes in their quest for protein, people turned to curious critters that we might not consider menu items today. For instance, during lean times or in certain regions, hedgehogs were apparently consumed, sometimes baked in clay, which, when broken open, would pull the spines away. Squirrels, badgers, and various small birds that we'd now consider songbirds might also find their way into the pot. It was all about survival. One quirky tidbit is the belief that barnacle geese, birds that often appeared in winter without anyone seeing them nest, were thought to spontaneously generate from barnacles growing on driftwood. This convenient loophole meant they were sometimes classified as fish by the church, allowing them to be eaten on fasting days when other meat was forbidden. Clever, right? Or perhaps just wishful thinking by hungry people. So you can see the meaty misery. If you weren't fortunate enough to have your own pig thriving, or live in a well-stocked noble household with hunting rights and access to fresh kills, meat was a tantalizing but often out-of-reach luxury. And even when it did appear on your trencher, you'd be scrutinizing it closely, hoping it wasn't going to fight back from the inside after you'd eaten it. It was a world where the idea of choosing your cut of meat, or worrying about its fat content, would have been laughably absurd. You ate what you could get, when you could get it, and you hoped for the best. The grumbling in your stomach was as much from uncertainty as from hunger, so your gritty bread is a daily trial, and a good, hearty piece of meat is a rare and often suspect treat. But what about those days when even that suspect meat is off the menu? Welcome to the world of medieval fasting, a significant chunk of your year where religious observance dictated a meat-free diet. This wasn't just a Lenten affair. We're talking Fridays, often Wednesdays and Saturdays too, vigils before major feast days. It all added up. You might spend nearly half the year unable to touch even that stringy old hen or piece of overly salted pork. This meant a heavy reliance on fish if you could get it, and if you couldn't, well, things got even more creative and often even more questionable. These were the fishy fiascos and the weird alternatives that filled the fasting void. For those living near the coast, or by major rivers and lakes, fresh fish was a viable option, at least some of the time. Herring was a major player, especially in Northern Europe. Vast quantities were caught, salted, and barreled, becoming a staple commodity traded far inland. Cod, too, was often preserved by drying until it was as hard as a board on stockfish, or by salting. To prepare stockfish, you'd have to rehydrate it by soaking and often pound it mercilessly to make it even vaguely edible. Imagine trying to tenderize a piece of plywood. That's the kind of effort we're talking about. Your jaw would get a serious workout. Even freshwater fish played a role. Pike, carp, bream, perch, eels. The wealthy even had their own stew ponds on their estates, artificially stocked pools ensuring a ready supply of fresh fish, a real status symbol. You, however, are more likely relying on what can be caught locally in the communal stream if you have access rights, or what comes, often much handled and far from fresh, from the market. The problem with fresh fish, of course, is that it doesn't stay fresh for long without refrigeration. In an era with no ice-making capabilities beyond what winter naturally provided, and slow transport, fish turned foul very quickly. This is where the fishmonger comes in, another merchant whose reputation was often aromatic, and not in a good way. Disguising the smell of slightly off fish was an art form. Strong sauces, often vinegar-based, were employed liberally. A common trick was to douse fish in verjuice, the incredibly tart juice of unripe grapes, which could somewhat mask the beginnings of decay. Remember our friend the barnacle goose from the previous section? That counts as fish classification for certain birds during fasting periods highlights a quirky tidbit. People were looking for loopholes. Beavers, too, were sometimes on the ambiguous menu. Because their tails were scaly and they spent a lot of time in water, some theologians conveniently classified their tails as fish, making beaver tail a permitted fasting day dish. Delicious, no? I'm sure it had a certain je ne sais quoi. Probably tasted like desperation with a hint of pond scum. For those living far from water sources, or when even preserved fish was too expensive or unavailable, the fasting menu became even more monotonous and frankly rather bleak. This is where things could get very inventive in a stomach-churning kind of way. Dishes were made to resemble meat or eggs, even if they contained neither. Mock turtle soup has nothing on some medieval Lenten creations. For example, almond milk, made by grinding almonds and mixing them with water, was a crucial ingredient. It could be used to create imitation butter or cheese, and formed the base of many sauces and pottages, providing a creamy texture when dairy was forbidden. Fried bread or pasta shapes might be served to mimic meat or eggs. Ground almonds and rice flour could be used to create elaborate, if bland, substitutes. Historians still argue whether the extensive fasting regulations, particularly the exclusion of animal fats, contributed significantly to dietary deficiencies among the general populace. It's a complex question, as the fasting diet wasn't necessarily devoid of nutrients if it included a variety of grains, pulses, vegetables, and access to some form of fish or marine mammals. However, for the poorest, who might only have access to their usual bread and perhaps a thin vegetable pottage, these lean days could have been truly detrimental. Their already limited diet became even more so. You weren't just giving up a luxury, you were giving up vital calories and protein your body desperately needed, all in the name of piety. It's not surprising that people eagerly awaited the end of fasting periods. Feast days following these periods of restriction were often truly epic, with a massive consumption of all the meats and dairy products that had been forbidden. But during the fast itself, your palate was likely bored, your stomach often still rumbling, and your ingenuity taxed to the limit to make something edible out of the limited permissible ingredients. Imagine eating dried salted herring, day in and day out, or a pottage of watery vegetables and grain, knowing that the lord of the manor is probably tucking into a freshly caught beaver tail, smug in his theological loophole. The injustice would be almost as hard to swallow as the third day of slightly off vinegary cod. The sheer variety of fish names that appear in medieval texts, roach, dace, chub, barbel, gudgeon, many of which we barely consider food fish today, speaks to the desperation to find anything aquatic to put on the table. There were also porpoises and even whales, termed great fish of the sea or royal fish, that were consumed, especially by coastal communities or those wealthy enough to afford such a massive catch. However, these were not your everyday fare. Your reality on a fasting day is more likely to be a small piece of very salty fish, or perhaps just an extra ladleful of that thin, watery pea soup, seasoned with disappointment. And you'd count the days until you could once again eat something that had walked on land, even if it was just that old, tough chicken. It's a long, slow wait, punctuated by the smell of questionable fish and the gnawing reminder of what you can't have. All right, so your bread is an adventure in dentistry. Your meat is a rare and risky business, and your fish days are often an exercise in olfactory tolerance and theological gymnastics. Surely you think the vegetables and fruits must offer some vibrant, healthy respite? Well, you might want to temper those expectations. While fruits and vegetables were indeed part of the medieval diet, fresh produce as we know it, available year-round, bursting with flavor, crisp and enticing, was largely a seasonal dream, and what was available was often coarse, underdeveloped, and sometimes viewed with suspicion. Your 5 a day would have been a much grimmer affair. Let's start with the basics. Availability. There are no global supply chains air freighting delicate berries from the other side of the world in the dead of winter. You ate what grew locally, and you ate it when it was in season. This meant that for long stretches of the year, particularly during the bleak winter and early spring months, fresh vegetables and fruits were simply not available. Your diet would narrow considerably, relying on stored root vegetables, dried beans and peas, and perhaps some hardy greens like kale or cabbage, if you were lucky enough to have a small garden plot. The mainstream historical fact here is that much of the medieval population, especially the peasantry, subsisted on a diet that was seasonally monotonous and often lacking in key vitamins found in fresh produce, leading to conditions like scurvy, especially during late winter and early spring, which was often called the hungry gap. Even when vegetables were in season, the varieties grown were often very different from what we're used to today. Carrots, for instance, were not the bright orange sweet specimens we know. They were often purple, yellow, or white, and likely tougher and more bitter. Modern agriculture has spent centuries selectively breeding for sweetness, size, and tenderness. Your medieval carrot was a more rustic, earthier character, probably pulled from heavy, unimproved soil. Onions and leeks were staples, pungent and enduring, adding flavor to the ubiquitous pottages that simmered over many a hearth. Garlic, too, was well known and used, both for flavor and for its supposed medicinal properties, perhaps to ward off more than just vampires, given the general state of things. Cabbages, turnips, and parsnips were hardy stalwarts of the peasant garden, capable of surviving harsher conditions and storing reasonably well. But imagine a diet heavily reliant on boiled cabbage and turnips for months on end. Your culinary excitement levels might not be sky high. Fruits, too, were largely a seasonal affair. Apples and pears were common, but again, many varieties would have been smaller, tartar, or more suited for cooking into cider or perry, a fermented pear drink, than for eating raw. Berries like raspberries, blackberries, and wild strawberries were foraged in season, a welcome sweet treat. But their season was fleeting. Cherries, plums, and damsons added variety in the summer months. But if you were craving a banana or a pineapple, forget it. Such exotic delights were unknown in most of Europe, or at best fantastical tales brought back by the very, very few who had traveled to distant, almost mythical lands. A quirky tidbit here. Some fruits and vegetables we consider commonplace were viewed with considerable suspicion when first introduced. For instance, tomatoes, though their arrival is more early modern than strictly medieval for most of Europe, were initially often grown as ornamentals, with some believing them to be poisonous due to their relation to the nightshade family. This suspicion of new or unfamiliar plant foods was not uncommon. It's also worth noting that raw vegetables and fruits were often not the preferred way to consume them, particularly for the upper classes, due to prevailing medical theories. Humoral theory, which dominated medical thinking for centuries, suggested that raw foods were cold and moist and could upset the body's delicate balance of humors. Therefore, most vegetables and many fruits were cooked, often extensively, boiling away a good portion of their nutrients and any crisp texture they might have once possessed. Salads, known as salés, did exist, but that they were often composed of young leaves, herbs, and flowers, and might be blanched or dressed with oil and vinegar. Historians still argue whether the preference for cooked vegetables was solely due to humoral theory, or also a practical response to the often unreliable safety of raw produce, which could be contaminated by unclean water or poor hygiene in handling. A thoroughly boiled turnip might be less gastronomically thrilling, but it was also less likely to give you a nasty bout of dysentery. Foraging played a crucial role, especially for the poor. Woods and hedgerows could provide wild greens, like nettles, which, when young and cooked, are surprisingly nutritious. Mushrooms, a risky game of identification. Wild garlic, nuts, and those seasonal berries. This free food was a vital supplement to what could be grown or afforded. However, it also meant a lot of time and effort spent searching and gathering, often for a meager return. You'd need a good knowledge of local plants, what was edible, what was medicinal, and what would send you to an early grave. Not exactly a leisurely stroll in the park with a wicker basket. So, while your mental image of a medieval feast might include overflowing bowls of colorful produce, the reality for most of the year, was far more muted. Your greens were likely to be some heavily boiled cabbage or kale, maybe some onions and leeks in your pottage. Your fruit might be a dried apple, wrinkled and chewy, saved from the autumn harvest. The vibrant colors and crisp textures you associate with a healthy diet were fleeting luxuries. It's another layer of the culinary challenge. Another reason why simply getting enough varied nutrients into your body was a constant, underlying struggle. You weren't just fighting off hunger. You were often fighting off a kind of pervasive blandness, a dietary landscape painted in shades of brown and dull green. We've trudged through the grainy landscape of your bread, navigated the risky business of meat, and pondered the peculiar alternatives of fasting days. We've even surveyed the rather muted palette of medieval fruits and vegetables. So, what about dairy? Milk? Cheese? Butter? Surely these offered some creamy comfort, some reliable sustenance? Well, yes and no. Dairy products were certainly part of the medieval diet, but they came with their own set of challenges, from rapid spoilage to very rudimentary production methods, making your experience with them far from the sanitized, homogenized world of dairy we know today. The path from cow, goat, or ewe to your trencher was a short and often precarious one. Milk, the very essence of dairy, was a highly perishable commodity. In an era entirely devoid of refrigeration, fresh milk was a luxury with an incredibly short shelf life, especially in warmer weather. It would turn sour and curdle within hours if not consumed quickly or processed into something more stable. If you were a peasant with your own cow or a few goats, you might enjoy fresh milk, but it would be unpasteurized, straight from the animal, carrying with it all the attendant risks of bacteria. Brucellosis, for example, could be contracted from unpasteurized milk, leading to debilitating fevers. So, while that warm, fresh milk might seem appealing, it was also a bit of a bacterial lottery. For town dwellers, fresh milk was even harder to come by, and often viewed with suspicion, as it could be adulterated by unscrupulous vendors, watered down, or worse. Remember the miller adding chalk to your flour? Dairy vendors had their own tricks. Because fresh milk was so ephemeral, much of it was immediately transformed into products with a longer lifespan, primarily cheese and butter. Butter production was straightforward enough. Milk was left to allow the cream to rise, which was then skimmed off and churned. This was usually done by hand, a laborious process using a dash churn, that iconic upright plunger in a wooden tub. The resulting butter would be heavily salted to help preserve it, giving it a strong, tangy flavor, far removed from the sweet cream butter you might spread on your toast. It was also likely to be a deep yellow, almost orange, if made in summer when cows were grazing on fresh pasture rich in beta-carotene, but paler and less flavorful in winter. There were no consistent standards, so the quality, texture, and saltiness could vary wildly. Sometimes, if you were unlucky, your butter might have a cheesy or rancid off taste. No charming artisanal notes here, just impending spoilage. Cheese was the real star of medieval dairy preservation. It was a way to convert abundant summer milk into a concentrated, calorie-dense food that could last through the lean winter months. Cheesemaking was a vital skill, particularly for women in rural households. The process was, by our standards, incredibly basic. Milk would be gently warmed, often over the same open fire used for all cooking. Then a coagulant would be added. This wasn't always refined rennet from a calf's stomach. It could be certain plant extracts like thistle flowers or lady's bed straw, which possess enzymes that curdle milk. Once the curds formed, they were separated from the whey, the watery liquid left behind, often drunk by the poor or fed to pigs, as little was wasted. These curds were then pressed, sometimes salted, and left to ripen or dry. The types of cheeses made were predominantly hard, dry, and often quite sharp or tangy, designed for longevity rather than subtle flavor profiles. Soft, fresh cheeses were made, but they wouldn't keep for long. Think less brie and more something akin to a very firm, salty, and possibly slightly rubbery cheddar, or a dry, crumbly cottage cheese. The mainstream historical fact is that cheese, along with bread, formed the backbone of the diet for many, especially peasants and laborers, providing essential protein and fat. Monasteries also became significant centers of cheese-making, refining techniques and producing cheeses that could be stored and even traded. However, hygiene during the cheese-making process was, shall we say, variable. Unwanted molds, beyond the desirable ones in specific cheese types, and bacteria could easily contaminate the cheese, leading to off flavors or spoilage. A quirky tidbit. Some medieval cheeses were apparently so hard that they were incredibly difficult to cut, and stories abound of them being used, somewhat facetiously, as makeshift weapons or even carved into inedible objects. Imagine trying to slice into a cheese that could double as a doorstop. Historians still argue whether the average peasant consistently had access to enough cheese to make a significant nutritional difference, or if it was often a carefully rationed item reserved for adding a little flavor or richness to an otherwise bland meal of pottage or bread. Local tithes and rents often had to be paid in kind, with cheese being a common item, which could reduce the amount available for the family's own consumption. The type of milk used also varied by region and wealth. Cow's milk was common, but sheep's milk and goat's milk were also widely used for cheese-making, each imparting its own distinct flavor and texture. Goat cheese, for example, would likely have been even tangier and more assertive than what you might find in a modern deli. And what about other dairy delights? Yogurt-like fermented milks existed in some cultures but weren't as universally widespread in Western Europe as cheese. Ice cream? An absolute fantasy. The idea of freezing cream with sugar and flavorings would have been incomprehensible. Your medieval dairy experience is about fundamental preservation and basic nutrition. It's about salty butter that might make your eyes water a bit, and hard cheese that your teeth have to work at. It's about the constant awareness that what is fresh today will be sour tomorrow. So, while dairy did provide essential calories and nutrients, it wasn't the smooth, creamy, consistently pleasant experience we expect. It was another part of the daily food landscape that was functional, often coarse, and carried its own subtle, and sometimes not so subtle warnings of imperfection. You wouldn't be casually grating Parmesan over your pasta. You'd be carefully husbanding your hunk of hard, salty cheese, hoping it lasts until the next batch is ready. We've chewed our way through the gritty realities of your daily bread, the often elusive and risky nature of meat, the questionable offerings of fasting days, the muted world of medieval vegetables, and the rather rudimentary state of dairy. Now, what are you washing all this down with? Surely a nice, clean, refreshing glass of water, or perhaps a hearty, flavorful ale. Well, hold your goblets, because your beverage options in medieval times were often as fraught with peril and disappointment as the food. Clean water was a luxury many couldn't afford or access, and while ale was ubiquitous, it was frequently weak, questionable, and came with its own dregs of doubt. Let's start with water, the most fundamental of all drinks. Today we turn on a tap, and in most developed regions, reasonably expect safe, potable water to flow out. This was far from the medieval reality. Sources of clean, uncontaminated water were prized, but often scarce. If you lived near a fresh, fast-flowing spring, you were fortunate. Rivers and streams were common sources, but these were also the medieval equivalent of open sewers. All manner of waste, human, animal, industrial, from tanners, dyers, and butchers, for example, found its way into the watercourses. So that sparkling river water might look inviting, but it could be teeming with bacteria like cholera and typhoid. Wells could offer cleaner water, especially if deep and well-maintained, but many were shallow, easily contaminated by surface runoff or nearby latrines. Monasteries often had sophisticated water management systems, sometimes with lead pipes and filtration beds. But for the average peasant hut or crowded urban dwelling, finding genuinely safe water was a constant challenge. Remember that lack of hygiene in the kitchens we briefly touched on? It extended everywhere. Because of the risks associated with water, many people, if they could afford it, avoided drinking it raw. The common belief, not entirely unfounded, was that untreated water could make you sick. This led to a massive consumption of alcoholic beverages, primarily ale, and to a lesser extent, wine. The brewing process for ale, which involved boiling the water, did indeed kill many harmful pathogens, making it a safer, though not entirely foolproof option. The mainstream historical fact here is that ale was a dietary staple for almost everyone, including children, in many parts of medieval Europe, particularly in the north where grapes for wine didn't grow well. It wasn't just a drink, it was a source of calories and some nutrients. Consumption was prodigious, with estimates suggesting several pints or even gallons per person per day, though this figure needs context. But the ale you're drinking isn't the craft IPA or rich stout you might enjoy today. Medieval ale was typically much weaker, with a lower alcohol content, often referred to as small beer. It was brewed without hops. Hops only became common in brewing later in the medieval period, spreading from the continent to England. Instead, a mixture of herbs and spices called gruit was used to flavor and preserve the ale, contributing a range of often unpredictable flavors, some pleasant, some less so. Without hops, the ale also had a much shorter shelf life and could spoil quickly, turning sour or cloudy. You might find yourself drinking something that tasted a bit like yeasty, slightly alcoholic, herb-infused ditch water. Not exactly a connoisseur's choice. Brewing was largely a domestic task, with many households, particularly in rural areas, brewing their own small beer for family consumption. The quality would vary enormously, depending on the skill of the brewer, often the woman of the house, the quality of the malted barley, and the cleanliness of the brewing equipment. Large monastic establishments and noble households had dedicated brewhouses and produced ale in larger quantities and often of better quality. In towns, commercial brewers and alewives, women who brewed and sold ale, catered to the public, but again, quality and honesty were ongoing concerns. Ale could be watered down or made with substandard ingredients. One quirky tidbit is the ale conner, an official appointed in some towns and manors whose job was to test the quality of ale. According to popular lore, one method involved the ale conner pouring some of the ale onto a wooden bench and then sitting on it in his leather breeches. If the breeches stuck to the bench after a certain time, it supposedly indicated that sugar or other undesirable sticky substances had been added to the ale, or perhaps that it was simply a good, strong brew. Interpretations vary, but it paints a vivid, if slightly sticky picture of medieval quality control. Wine was the preferred drink in southern Europe where grapes grew abundantly. It was also the drink of choice for the wealthy in northern regions, imported at considerable expense. Like ale, wine could vary hugely in quality. There were fine wines, but also a lot of rough, acidic plonk. Wine didn't always travel well in wooden casks and could easily spoil or turn to vinegar. Sweet, spiced wines like Hippocras, wine mulled with sugar and spices, were popular, especially among the affluent, as the spices could help mask the flavor of less than perfect wine, and were also seen as medicinally beneficial. Historians still argue whether the high consumption of low-alcohol, small beer truly prevented widespread dehydration and waterborne illness, or if its nutritional contribution was more significant than its hydrating properties, especially given the often questionable water it was made with. Other beverages included cider, made from apples, and perry, from pears, particularly in regions where these fruits were plentiful. Mead, a fermented honey drink, was an ancient beverage, though perhaps less common as an everyday drink by the high medieval period compared to ale, due to the expense of honey. Milk, as we discussed, was rarely drunk fresh by adults in large quantities due to spoilage, though whey, the byproduct of cheese-making, was sometimes consumed, so your options are somewhat limited. You could risk the river, try your luck with the well, or more likely you'd be sipping on your daily ration of thin, possibly sour ale, hoping it didn't have too many strange floaty bits in it from a hasty brewing process. The idea of a refreshing beverage often meant less likely to kill you immediately. It's a far cry from aisles filled with bottled waters, sodas, juices, and a dizzying array of alcoholic options. Your medieval thirst was quenched with a good deal more pragmatism and a lot less pleasure. So, you're navigating this challenging culinary landscape. Your bread is gritty, meat is a gamble, fish can be an ordeal, vegetables are often dull, dairy is rudimentary, and even your drink choices are limited and sometimes suspect. You might think, well, surely they could liven things up with some spices. Ah, if only it were that simple. In the medieval world, spices were the ultimate luxury, more akin to gold dust or precious jewels than common pantry staples. Their scarcity and astronomical cost meant that for most people, like you, the vibrant transformative power of spices was something heard about in travelers' tales or glimpsed on the Lord's table, not something that regularly graced your own humble pottage. Their primary role for the wealthy wasn't just flavor. It was a spectacular display of status, and sometimes a desperate attempt to mask the taste of food that was, well, on the turn. Imagine a world where black pepper, that everyday grinder on your kitchen counter, was so valuable it could be used to pay rent, taxes, or even dowries. Individual peppercorns were counted out like coins. This is the reality of the medieval spice trade. Spices like cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, mace, ginger, saffron, cardamom, and galangal had to be transported over vast distances from Asia and the Middle East, through treacherous trade routes controlled by various middlemen, each adding their own markup. The journey was long, dangerous, and expensive, meaning that by the time these exotic aromatics reached the kitchens of European nobles, their price was beyond exorbitant. A mainstream historical fact is that Venice and Genoa became immensely wealthy city-states, largely through their control of the spice trade routes into Europe. Their dominance allowed them to dictate prices and reap enormous profits. For you, the common peasant or struggling artisan, these spices were utterly out of reach. Your flavorings were limited to what you could grow in a small herb garden or forage locally. Think parsley, sage, rosemary, and thyme. Yes, just like the song, though perhaps less romantically acquired. Mustard, often grown wild or easily cultivated, was a common and relatively pungent option, providing a bit of a kick. Horseradish, with its fiery heat, could also liven things up. Garlic and onions, as we've mentioned, were workhorses of flavor. But the warm, complex, and exotic notes of Eastern spices? That was pure fantasy. Your pottage would taste of its base ingredients, the leeks, the beans, the grain, perhaps with a hint of thyme, but nothing more transformative. Even for the wealthy, who could afford spices, their use was sometimes enthusiastic, shall we say, to the point of overwhelming the natural flavors of the food. This leads to an interesting debate among food historians. Historians still argue whether the heavy use of expensive spices in aristocratic medieval cuisine was primarily to show off wealth and status, or genuinely to mask the flavor of poorly preserved meat and fish. The argument for conspicuous consumption is strong. Using a vast array of costly spices in a single dish was a clear signal to your guests that you were incredibly rich and influential. It was culinary bling. However, given the challenges of food preservation we've discussed, it's also plausible that a good dousing of cloves and cinnamon could make slightly off pheasant or week-old salmon a bit more palatable. Perhaps it was a bit of both, a convenient way to salvage expensive ingredients while simultaneously broadcasting your affluence. Oh, this old swan? Yes, it's positively swimming in saffron, darling. Don't mind the faint whiff of the crypt. The range of spices available to the rich was impressive, if you could afford them. Saffron, worth more than its weight in gold, was used not only for its delicate flavor, but also for its brilliant yellow color. Used to dye foods like rice or even make baked goods glisten like treasure. Ginger, both fresh and dried, was popular. Cloves and nutmeg, often used together, provided that warm, Christmassy aroma we still associate with them. Grains of paradise, a West African spice with a peppery, cardamom-like flavor, was another fashionable import. A quirky tidbit, one spice that was sometimes used, though perhaps more for perceived medicinal properties than pure flavor, was mummy or mummia. This was powdered human remains, usually from ancient Egyptian mummies, imported and sold as a rather ghoulish cure-all. While not strictly a culinary spice, it highlights the sometimes bizarre and exotic nature of substances that were traded and consumed. Probably not something you'd sprinkle on your porridge. The lack of access to these powerful flavor agents for the general populace meant that food was, by and large, much blander than we are accustomed to. It also meant that when food was starting to go bad, there were fewer ways to disguise it effectively. You'd be relying on a strong stomach and perhaps a bit of wishful thinking. Salt, as we know, was a primary preservative, but it was also a flavor enhancer, often the only strong flavor enhancer available to common folk beyond a few pungent herbs. So, your food wasn't just bland, it was often very, very salty too. Consider the impact of this spice scarcity on your daily meals. That boiled turnip isn't getting a dusting of nutmeg. That piece of questionable salted fish isn't being perked up with a ginger lace sauce. Your main source of flavor variation might come from the degree of char on your bread, or the particular combination of beans and weeds in your pottage. It's a world where subtle notes are lost, and the strong, often unwelcome flavors of food nearing its expiry date are harder to ignore. The vibrant, aromatic world of spices that we take for granted, the ability to transform simple ingredients with a pinch of this, or a dash of that, was a distant dream for most medieval diners. Their food experience was shaped by this absence, making the already challenging nature of their diet even more monotonous and, at times, frankly, quite unappetizing. The spice of life was, for them, a very literal and unattainable luxury. After the somewhat bland and often challenging savoriness of everyday medieval fare, surely there was some sweetness to be found. A little something to lift the spirits and delight the palate? Well, if you're imagining sugar-dusted pastries, rich chocolate desserts, or even a simple spoonful of jam on your bread, you'll need to drastically adjust your expectations. Sweetness in the medieval world was a precious commodity, and for most people, the primary, if not sole source of intense sweetness was honey. Sugar, as we know it, was an almost mythical substance, a costly dream available only to the fabulously wealthy, and even then, often used more as a spice or medicine than a common sweetener. Honey was king. Beekeeping was a widespread and important practice, from monastic apiaries to individual peasants keeping a few hives. Honey was harvested in the late summer or early autumn, a sticky, golden bounty that was highly valued. It wasn't just for sweetening food. It was used to make mead, that ancient fermented honey drink we touched upon. It was also used in preserving fruits to some extent, and it recognized medicinal properties. But even honey wasn't an unlimited resource. A bad year for bees, perhaps due to weather or disease, meant a poor honey harvest, and thus less sweetness to go around. The quality and flavor of honey would also vary dramatically depending on the flowers the bees had foraged from. You might get a light floral honey one year, and a dark, strong, almost molasses-like honey the next. There were no consistent supermarket brands here. Using honey in cooking had its challenges. It has a strong flavor that can easily dominate other ingredients, and it behaves differently from sugar when heated or baked. Recipes from the period that call for sweeteners often specify honey. You might find it in gingerbread-like concoctions or used to glaze meats for the wealthy, creating that sweet savory contrast that was popular in aristocratic cuisine. But for your daily pottage or coarse bread, a dollop of honey would have been a rare treat, carefully rationed. A simple pleasure like honey on bread would be savored, not taken for granted. Remember how spices were used as a status symbol? Well, ostentatious use of honey, especially in grand dishes for feasts, also signaled wealth. Now let's talk about sugar. Cane sugar, originally cultivated in places like India and Persia, began to trickle into Europe via the Mediterranean trade routes during the Middle Ages. The mainstream historical fact is that sugar was initially treated as an expensive spice or a medicine, sold by apothecaries in small quantities at incredibly high prices. It was believed to have various health benefits, good for colds, chest ailments, and digestion. Ironic, given what we know today about excessive sugar consumption. It was often sold in hard, conical loaves, from which small amounts would be scraped or chipped off. This loaf sugar was a far cry from the granulated or powdered sugar we use so freely. For most of your medieval life, you might never even see sugar, let alone taste it. It was truly the food of kings and the very wealthiest nobles. As the medieval period progressed, and particularly into the later Middle Ages, sugar plantations began to be established by Europeans in places like Sicily, Cyprus, and then further afield in the Atlantic islands like Madeira and the Canaries, often using enslaved labor. This gradually increased the supply and slightly reduced the price. But it remained a luxury item well beyond the means of the common person for centuries. A quirky tidbit is the art of subtleties or sauteltes at grand medieval banquets. These were elaborate sculptural confectionaries made from sugar paste, marzipan's ancestor, often made with almond meal and sugar, and other rich ingredients, crafted into fantastical shapes like castles, animals, or allegorical scenes. These were purely for display and conspicuous consumption, showcasing the host's immense wealth and the skill of their cooks. You certainly wouldn't be finding a miniature sugar dragon on your peasant's table. Subtleties, in this context, really meant not so subtle displays of "I'm richer than you." So, if honey was rationed and sugar was a fantasy, where else could a hint of sweetness come from? Ripe fruits, in season, were one source. Sweet apples, pears, berries, plums. These provided natural sugars, though, as we discussed, medieval fruit varieties were often less intensely sweet than modern ones. Dried fruits, like raisins or figs, if you could get them, figs and dates being expensive imports, were also concentrated sources of sweetness. Some vegetables, like parsnips and carrots, have a natural sweetness that would be more noticeable in a diet largely devoid of other sweet flavors. Even certain grains, when malted, develop a sweetness which would contribute to the flavor profile of ale, for instance. Historians still argue whether the general lack of concentrated sweeteners in the everyday diet contributed to a different taste preference in medieval people, perhaps making them more sensitive to subtle sweet notes in natural foods, or if the craving for sweetness was just as strong as ours, but largely unfulfilled. It's hard to know for sure, but it's likely that the intense sweet tooth prevalent in many modern societies would have been an alien concept, or at least a deeply frustrated one. Your experience of sweetness is therefore profoundly different from ours. There are no sugary cereals for breakfast, no chocolate bars for a snack, no fizzy sweet drinks to quench your thirst. A piece of honeycomb, chewed slowly to extract every last drop of sweetness, might be a highlight of your year. The subtle sweetness of a roasted parsnip might be genuinely noteworthy. It's a world where sweetness is rare, natural, and deeply cherished when encountered. The absence of readily available cheap sugar fundamentally shaped the medieval palate, and the kinds of treats, or lack thereof, that were available. You're not worrying about empty calories from sugar. You're more likely dreaming of finding an extra ripe berry by the wayside. We've established that your ingredients are often challenging. Your bread is gritty, your meat suspect, your fasting fare monotonous, vegetables are coarse, dairy is basic, drinks are dubious, spices are absent, and sweeteners are a rare luxury. Now, how is all this unpromising raw material transformed into something edible? Welcome to the medieval kitchen, or more likely for you, the simple hearth, where cookery calamities were an everyday occurrence. Open fires, a very limited range of tools, and a lack of precise temperature control meant that preparing food was often a battle against burning, undercooking, and general culinary mishap. For the vast majority of the population, including you, the kitchen wasn't a separate room filled with gleaming copper pots and well-organized pantries. It was simply the central open hearth in your one-room or two-room dwelling. This fire was the heart of the home. It provided heat, light, and the means to cook. Cooking was done directly over the flames or on the hot embers. The iconic image is the cauldron, a large metal pot, if you were lucky enough to own one. Some made do with earthenware, suspended from a hook or tripod over the fire. Into this cauldron went, well, pretty much everything. This was the home of the perpetual pottage or stew, a bubbling concoction that might simmer for days, with new ingredients added as they became available. Yesterday's leftover beans, today's foraged greens, perhaps a small piece of sinewy meat if it was a good day, all mingling together. Not exactly fine dining, more like a culinary lucky dip. Temperature control with an open fire is, to put it mildly, an art form, and a very inexact one. Too much wood, and your pottage boils over, or the outside of whatever you're trying to roast is incinerated while the inside remains raw. Too little, and everything takes an eternity to cook, assuming it cooks through at all. There are no convenient temperature dials here. You're judging by the height of the flames, the color of the embers, and a good deal of hope. Ash and soot were constant companions. frequently finding their way into the food, adding an extra unwanted grittiness to your already gritty bread. Imagine trying to bake bread in a pot buried in hot embers or on a flat stone placed by the fire. Achieving an even bake without a burnt crust and a doughy interior was a major triumph. You'd probably scrape off the worst of the char and try to convince yourself it added character. Your cooking utensils were basic and few. A knife, which might also be your all-purpose eating knife, a wooden spoon or two, perhaps a ladle. Pots, as mentioned, were valuable. Metal pots were more durable but expensive. Earthenware pots were cheaper, but prone to cracking or shattering, which could mean the loss of an entire meal, a minor disaster when food was scarce. Spits for roasting meat directly over the fire were common, especially for those who could afford larger cuts of meat. Turning the spit was often a job for a lowly servant, or even a specially trained dog, the turnspit dog, a now extinct breed, in wealthier households. For you, if you were lucky enough to have a small piece of meat to roast, you might rig up a simpler arrangement, perhaps propping it on green wood sticks and turning it by hand, trying not to singe your eyebrows in the process. One mainstream historical fact is the sheer amount of firewood required for daily cooking and heating, which was a significant burden, especially for poorer families who might have to spend considerable time gathering it or pay dearly for it. This scarcity of fuel often dictated cooking methods, favoring long, slow simmering in a single pot to conserve heat. Frying was done, but not as commonly as boiling or stewing, perhaps in a shallow metal pan, or even on a heated flat stone if you had a little fat or oil. But fats and oils were precious. Lard, pig fat, was common where pigs were raised. Butter, as we know, was valuable. Olive oil was used in southern Europe but was an expensive import further north. The idea of deep frying something like modern French fries? Utterly impractical and wasteful of precious resources. In wealthier households and castles, kitchens were larger, better equipped and often chaotic, smoke-filled infernos. Huge fireplaces, sometimes large enough for a person to stand in, could accommodate multiple cauldrons and spits roasting whole animals. Ovens built of stone or brick were available for baking bread, pies, and roasted dishes. But even here, managing the heat of a massive wood-fired oven was a skilled job. One quirky tidbit from these grand kitchens is the existence of scullions, the lowest-ranking kitchen servants, whose job was the endless, grimy task of cleaning pots and pans with sand, ashes, or rough scouring rushes. Their hands must have been perpetually raw. It wasn't a glamorous life, scrubbing burnt-on pottage from a soot-blackened cauldron. The recipes from the period, for those who could read them, which excluded most of the population, often give very vague instructions. Cook until done, or add enough saffron to make it yellow. There were no standardized measurements, no precise timings. Cooking was based on experience, intuition, and a good deal of luck. Sometimes dishes were deliberately complex and heavily disguised, a hallmark of sophisticated cuisine at the time. Meats might be ground mixed with spices, if you had them, and other ingredients, and then reformed to look like something else entirely, or cooked inside pastry coffins, the original term for a pie crust. Historians still argue whether this love of disguise and transformation in elite medieval cookery was purely for entertainment and display, or if it also served to mask the sometimes dubious quality of the base ingredients, much like the heavy spicing. Is it swan? Or just a very cleverly disguised old pigeon? Best not to ask, just admire the gilding. So picture yourself trying to prepare your family's meal. You're crouching by the smoky fire, stirring a pot of indeterminate mush with a wooden stick. Your eyes are stinging from the smoke. You're trying to gauge if the lump of something attempting to be bread on the hot stone is cooked through, or just blackened on the outside. A stray spark lands alarmingly close to your homespun tunic. It's a world away from your modern, well-ventilated kitchen with its oven thermostats and non-stick pans. The simple act of cooking was an often uncomfortable, uncertain, and smoky affair. No wonder that pottage, requiring minimal intervention once assembled, was such a staple. It was the medieval equivalent of a one-pot wonder, born more out of necessity and limited technology than culinary genius. Your chances of producing a perfectly cooked meal were slim. Your chances of something being a bit burnt, a bit bland, and a bit smoky were considerably higher. We've faced the unappetizing ingredients and wrestled with the often calamitous cooking methods over smoky open fires. Now, let's pull back the curtain a little further and peer into the general environment where this food was prepared and consumed. If you thought the cooking process itself sounded challenging, the pervasive lack of hygiene in and around medieval kitchens and eating areas would likely send your modern sensibilities screaming for the hand sanitizer. Kitchen cleanliness as we understand it, with disinfected surfaces, pest control, and readily available hot running water, was an utterly alien concept. This less than sanitary environment invited a whole host of unwelcome guests and added yet another layer of risk to your already precarious meals. Imagine your typical peasant dwelling. It's small, probably has an earthen floor, and shares its space with humans and quite possibly animals, especially in winter. Chickens might wander in and out. The family dog, if you have one, is rooting around for scraps. There's no running water, hot or cold, on tap. Water for cooking and cleaning, such as it is, has to be hauled from that often questionable well or stream we talked about earlier. Soap, while it existed in a rudimentary form, often made from animal fats and wood ash, was not a commonplace item for daily, general cleaning of utensils or food preparation surfaces. Your cutting board, if you even had a dedicated one beyond a slab of wood also used for other tasks, would be cleaned by a quick wipe, at best. Cross-contamination, that watchword of modern food safety, would have been an unavoidable daily event. Whatever was on your hands from mucking out the pigsty could easily end up flavoring your pottage. Appetizing, no? Pests were a constant battle. Rats and mice were ubiquitous, scurrying through dwellings, granaries, and food stores, nibbling at whatever they could find and leaving their droppings behind. Flies and other insects would swarm in warmer weather, landing on food with impunity. There were no window screens, no fly swatters, beyond perhaps a well-aimed clout. Food storage was a major challenge. Without refrigeration, keeping ingredients safe from pests and spoilage was incredibly difficult. Grain might be stored in sacks or bins, vulnerable to rodents and weevils. Meat, if you had any, was salted or smoked, as we've discussed, partly to make it less attractive to flies and maggots. Your pantry wasn't a cool, clean, sealed environment. It was more likely a dark corner or a simple chest, sharing its space with dust, cobwebs, and whatever critters had decided to move in. You'd probably just brush off the visible contaminants and hope for the best. Out of sight, out of mind, into the stew pot. Even in the grander kitchens of castles and noble houses, while there might be more space and dedicated staff, hygiene wasn't necessarily much better. These were busy, hot, smoky places, often located away from the main dining hall to minimize fire risk and smells, though not always successfully. The floors might be stone, but they'd still be greasy and littered with food scraps, attracting vermin. Large numbers of animals, for food, for transport, for hunting, were often housed nearby, contributing to the general miasma. One quirky tidbit is the practice of having rushes or straw strewn on the floors, even in dining halls. While this might have initially been intended to absorb spills and dirt, and perhaps add a little insulation, these rushes were often left unchanged for long periods, accumulating food debris, spilled ale, animal droppings, and all manner of unpleasantness. Erasmus, the Renaissance scholar, famously complained about English floors, describing layers of ancient filth built up over years. Nice. You'd be dining above a festering mat of historical grime. The personal hygiene of food preparers was also, let's say, less rigorous than modern standards would demand. Regular bathing was not common practice for most people. Hand washing before preparing food, while perhaps understood as a good idea by some, was certainly not enforced with the diligence we expect today, especially given the scarcity of clean water and soap. Your cook might have just come in from the fields or tending to livestock. It adds a whole new meaning to home-cooked meal. The mainstream historical fact is that outbreaks of foodborne illnesses like dysentery, salmonella, and E. coli, though they wouldn't have known these specific bacteria, were incredibly common and often deadly, particularly for the very young, the old, or those already weakened by malnutrition. The link between poor sanitation and disease was not well understood in the way it is now. Illness was often attributed to miasmas, bad air, imbalances in the humors, or divine displeasure, rather than the invisible germs lurking on unwashed hands or contaminated food. Historians still argue whether the pervasive filth was simply an accepted norm that people became inured to, or a constant source of low-level disgust and discomfort that people had little power to change. Perhaps it was a bit of both. When your daily struggle is simply getting enough calories to survive, the fastidiousness of scrubbing every surface might seem like a lower priority. However, writings from the period do sometimes mention unpleasant smells or visible dirt, suggesting that people were not entirely oblivious or indifferent. It's more likely they lacked the knowledge and resources to effectively combat the grime. So as you sit down to your medieval meal, consider the journey it has taken. The ingredients were often subpar, the cooking methods fraught with potential for error, and the environment in which it was all prepared was likely teeming with things you'd rather not think about. That slightly off taste in your pottage. It could be the lingering flavor of soot, the character of slightly old ingredients, or perhaps a more unwelcome microbial contribution. You're not just eating food. You're consuming a little piece of the unsanitized medieval world. It's a sobering thought, and one that makes you appreciate that dishwasher and antibacterial spray in your modern kitchen just a little bit more. Your stomach, back then, would have needed to be made of much sterner stuff. You'd develop an iron constitution, or you wouldn't last very long. We've braved the grim kitchens, the dubious ingredients, and the precarious cooking techniques. A recurring theme in all of this is the desperate need to make food last, to stretch precious resources from one harvest to the next, or to ensure that a slaughtered animal provides sustenance for weeks or months, not just a single feast. In an age utterly devoid of refrigeration or modern canning, food preservation was a constant critical concern. The methods available were effective in their way, but they often came at a steep cost to the flavor, texture, and sometimes even the nutritional value of the food. These were the preservation predicaments. Longevity often meant extreme salting, smoking, pickling, or drying, transforming fresh ingredients into something very different, and often much less palatable. Salt was the undisputed king of medieval food preservation. It's a powerful desiccant, drawing moisture out of food and creating an environment where spoilage bacteria struggled to survive. Vast quantities of salt were used, Meat, as we've discussed, was heavily salted or brined, soaked in a salt solution. Fish, especially herring and cod, were similarly treated, packed in barrels with layers of salt or air-dried after salting to become stockfish. This reliance on salt had a profound impact on the taste of food. Imagine eating meat that is so salty it makes your tongue tingle and your eyes water. This wasn't a subtle seasoning. It was an aggressive impregnation of salt throughout the entire cut. To make heavily salted meats even remotely edible, they often had to be soaked in fresh water for extended periods, sometimes for days, with multiple changes of water to draw out some of the excess salt. Even then, the resulting product would likely still be incredibly saline and often quite tough. Your kidneys would be working overtime. Smoking was another ancient and widely used technique. Meat and fish would be hung in a smoky environment, often in a dedicated smokehouse or even just in the chimney space above the domestic hearth. The smoke contains compounds that inhibit bacterial growth and also imparts a distinctive flavor. While smoked foods can be delicious, the medieval version might have been a rather intense, acrid affair, especially if the fire was managed poorly or unsuitable woods were used. The primary goal was preservation, not artisanal flavor profiles. Again, the process also dried out the food, contributing to its longevity, but also to its toughness. You'd be gnawing on that smoked ham for a good while. Drying was a fundamental method, particularly for grains, legumes, beans, peas, lentils, fruits, and some vegetables. Spreading grains out in the sun or a dry, airy place allowed them to be stored for long periods, provided they were kept safe from moisture and pests. Fruits like apples could be sliced and sun-dried or dried near the fire, creating chewy, concentrated versions of their fresh selves. This was a vital way to have some fruit available during the barren winter months. Stockfish, as mentioned, was cod-dried rock-hard in the cold Nordic air until it was almost indestructible and equally challenging to prepare and eat. The effort required to rehydrate and tenderize it speaks volumes about the need to make food last no matter what. Pickling, using vinegar or brine, was another common strategy, especially for vegetables. Cabbage could be preserved as a form of sauerkraut. Other vegetables, and even some fruits or meats, could be submerged in acidic solutions, which inhibited microbial growth. Verjuice, that tart juice of unripe grapes, was also used in some pickling processes, lending its sharp acidity. The resulting pickled products would be tangy, often intensely so, and their texture would be completely transformed. That crisp cucumber became a soft, sour pickle. It was a way of keeping vegetables on the menu beyond their short growing season, but it was a far cry from enjoying them fresh. Fermentation, while not always a deliberate act of preservation in the way we understand controlled fermentation today, played a role. The natural fermentation of cabbage into sauerkraut is one example. Ale and winemaking are, of course, forms of fermentation that also help preserve the calories and some nutrients from grains and grapes, making them safer to consume than potentially contaminated water. Sourdough bread, relying on wild yeasts and bacteria, is another. One quirky tidbit regarding preservation involves bog butter. Large quantities of butter have been found buried in peat bogs in Ireland and Scotland, some dating back thousands of years, including into the medieval period. The cool, low-oxygen, acidic environment of the bog preserved the butter, though it often acquired a strong cheese-like or earthy flavor. Historians still argue whether this practice was primarily for long-term storage, to hide valuable goods from raiders, or perhaps even to intentionally alter the butter's flavor. Imagine digging up your butter from the local swamp. The reliance on these fairly harsh preservation methods meant that the medieval palate had to be accustomed to strong, often aggressive flavors, intensely salty, sharply vinegary, or heavily smoked. The subtle nuances of fresh ingredients were often lost or deliberately obliterated in the name of making them last. The mainstream historical fact is that the quest for reliable food preservation drove innovation and trade. For instance, the salt trade was hugely important, with salt being sourced from coastal evaporation pans or inland mines and transported widely. Entire economies and diets were shaped by the availability of salt and other preservatives. These methods, while effective for staving off complete spoilage, didn't always guarantee safety. Molds could still grow on improperly dried or salted foods. Botulism, a deadly toxin, could develop in improperly preserved items, especially those that weren't acidic enough. The line between preserved and perilous could be a fine one. You're constantly assessing, is this salted pork still good, or is that greenish tinge something to worry about? Is this pickled cabbage just sour, or has it gone truly foul? It's another layer of anxiety surrounding your food, another reason why eating was not always a simple pleasure. Your senses, sight, smell, and a cautious first taste were your primary defense against food poisoning from preserved goods that had tipped over the edge. The idea of a best before date stamped on a package was centuries away. You were living that best guess date every day. We've explored the grim state of your daily bread, the risky allure of meat, the questionable nature of fish on fasting days, the blandness of vegetables, the rudeness of dairy, the dubiousness of drinks, the absence of exotic spices, the scarcity of sweeteners, the calamities of cookery, the horrors of hygiene, and the predicaments of preservation. Underlying all of this, casting a long, dark shadow over every meal, every mouthful, was the constant, terrifying threat of famine. Scarcity wasn't an occasional inconvenience. It was a recurring nightmare. A ghostly grip that tightened its hold with unnerving regularity, making hunger your frequent, unwelcome companion. The medieval agricultural system, while ingenious in many ways for its time, was highly vulnerable. It depended on a delicate balance of favorable weather, healthy livestock, and human labor. Any significant disruption to this balance could spell disaster. A prolonged drought could wither crops in the fields. Too much rain at harvest time could cause grain to rot or sprout before it could be gathered. Unusually cold springs could delay planting and shorten the growing season. Animal diseases could decimate herds, reducing not only the meat supply, but also the vital manure needed to fertilize the fields and the draft animals required for plowing. Remember the reliance on that single pottage pot? That wasn't just for convenience. It was often because there literally wasn't much else. When harvests failed, food prices would skyrocket, far beyond the reach of ordinary people like you. Your meager savings, if you had any, would quickly be exhausted. The grain you had stored from the previous year, carefully rationed, would dwindle at an alarming rate. This is when the hungry gap, that period in late winter and early spring before the new crops were ready, became a chasm of desperation. People were forced to eat things they would normally turn their noses up at: tree bark, roots, grasses, spoiled or diseased grain. There are harrowing accounts from chroniclers of famine periods describing widespread starvation, with people resorting to desperate measures simply to stay alive. The mainstream historical fact here is that events like the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 in Europe, triggered by several years of catastrophic weather, caused widespread death, disease, and social upheaval on a massive scale, with some estimates suggesting millions perished. This wasn't an isolated incident. Localized or regional famines were a tragically common feature of medieval life. During times of famine, the already stark social inequalities became even more pronounced. The wealthy nobles and clergy, with their larger landholdings and stored reserves, might weather the storm, though even they were not entirely immune. But for the peasant farmer whose crops had failed, or the urban laborer whose wages could no longer buy enough bread, there was little safety net. Charity from monasteries or wealthy individuals could alleviate some suffering, but it was rarely enough to cope with the widespread crisis. You might find yourself selling your few possessions, even your tools or livestock, for a handful of grain, mortgaging your future for a chance to survive the present. The bonds of community could fray as desperation set in. Theft of food would increase. Families might be forced to abandon their homes in search of regions less affected, though often such journeys were futile and perilous. The psychological toll of living under the constant threat of famine must have been immense. The anxiety about whether the next harvest would be sufficient, the fear of seeing your children go hungry. These would have been ever-present worries. Every change in the weather, every sign of blight on the crops, would be scrutinized with apprehension. The joy of a good harvest would be profound, but always tinged with the knowledge that hardship could be just around the corner. One quirky tidbit, though a grim one, concerns so-called famine recipes that sometimes appear in historical accounts or folklore, detailing how to prepare normally inedible substances to extract some minimal nourishment. Things like grinding acorns, which need extensive leaching to remove bitter tannins, or making bread from straw and tree bark, illustrate the depths of human desperation. These weren't culinary delights. They were acts of survival against overwhelming odds. Historians still argue about the precise frequency and severity of famine events and their long-term demographic impact. While major famines are well documented, smaller, localized food shortages were likely far more common and less consistently recorded. Yet they would have contributed to chronic malnutrition and increased susceptibility to disease for large segments of the population. This constant undercurrent of food insecurity shaped society in profound ways, influencing everything from agricultural practices and land tenure systems to religious beliefs and social structures. It was a world where, "Give us this day our daily bread," was not just a rote prayer, but a deeply felt, urgent plea. Even when it wasn't full-blown famine, scarcity was a familiar presence. Your diet, as we've seen, was often monotonous and nutritionally marginal. You were probably frequently hungry, even in good times, by our modern standards of satiety. The gnawing ache in your belly was a common sensation. This wasn't the intermittent fasting health trend of today. This was simply not having enough to eat. Your energy levels would be lower, your resilience to illness compromised. The idea of having too much food, of worrying about obesity, would have been utterly laughable for the vast majority. Your concerns were about filling that void, about finding enough sustenance to get through the day, to do the hard physical labor required to survive, and to hope that there would be something, anything in the pot tomorrow. Famine's ghostly grip wasn't just a historical event. It was woven into the very fabric of your daily existence, a constant reminder of how precarious life could be. You didn't just eat to live. You struggled to find enough to eat simply to keep on living. We've painted a rather bleak picture of your daily fare, haven't we? Gritty bread, questionable meat, monotonous fasting meals, bland vegetables, basic dairy, suspect drinks, a severe lack of spices and sweeteners, calamitous cookery, dubious hygiene, challenging preservation, and the ever-present shadow of famine. You might be wondering, Was it this bad for everyone? Did the rich, the nobles, the kings and queens suffer the same culinary indignities? Well, not quite. There was a vast gulf between noble nosh and peasant plight. But even the food of the wealthy had its own flaws, and often, the contrast just highlighted how truly dire things were for the common person. Let's start at the top of the food chain, so to speak, the tables of the nobility. Here, abundance and variety were the watchwords, at least in comparison to your meager offerings. They had access to prime cuts of fresh meat, venison from their hunting forests, beef and mutton from their own herds, and a dazzling array of poultry, including prestige birds like swan, peacock, and heron, often roasted whole and redressed in their feathers for spectacular presentation. Remember how you were risking life and limb if you even looked sideways at a deer in the forest. The lord of the manor was having it served on a silver platter. They also enjoyed finer white bread made from wheat, less likely to chip a tooth. Fish for them wasn't just dried herring. It was fresh pike from their own stew ponds, salmon, and expensive imported marine delicacies. Spices, those treasures from the East that were utterly beyond your reach, were used lavishly, almost excessively, in aristocratic kitchens. Dishes would be complex, multi-layered affairs, with intricate sauces flavored with cinnamon, cloves, ginger, saffron, and grains of paradise. Sugar, that other symbol of extreme wealth, was used not just as a sweetener, but also to create those incredible subtleties. The sculptural centerpieces we touched upon earlier, designed to awe and impress. Wine, often imported and of better quality, though still prone to spoilage, flowed freely alongside spiced ales. Their fruits and vegetables were more varied, perhaps grown in dedicated castle gardens, and might include more delicate or exotic items. The sheer quantity of food consumed at a noble feast could be staggering, with multiple courses, each comprising many different dishes. The mainstream historical fact here is that medieval feasting was as much about political display and social bonding as it was about sustenance. The ability to provide such lavish hospitality demonstrated power, wealth, and status. However, even this noble nosh wasn't without its problems. While they had access to fresh meat, the same issues of rapid spoilage without refrigeration still applied. Their cooks, while perhaps more skilled than your average cottage dweller, were still battling the same limitations of open fires and basic oven technology, albeit on a grander scale. The heavy use of spices, as we've discussed, might indeed have been partly to mask flavors that were a bit off. Gout, a painful form of inflammatory arthritis, was a common ailment among the wealthy, often linked to their rich diet, particularly the high consumption of meat and alcohol. So, while they weren't starving, their diet could lead to its own set of health issues. And let's not forget the hygiene. While their kitchens might have been larger, they weren't necessarily cleaner, and the general sanitation levels of a castle, with its latrines and animal enclosures, could be just as problematic as a peasant village, just on a larger, more concentrated scale. You might be eating off silver, but the journey from kitchen to plate was still fraught with unseen perils. Now contrast this with your peasant plight. Your daily meal, that pottage of grains and whatever vegetables you could scrounge, perhaps with a tiny piece of salted bacon for flavor if you were lucky, was a world away. Your bread was dark, coarse, and gritty. Meat was a rare luxury, and when you had it, it was often the tougher cuts, heavily preserved. Fish meant endless days of salted herring or coarse freshwater catches. Spices were non-existent. Sweetness came from a carefully hoarded drizzle of honey, if you were fortunate. Your drink was weak ale or questionable water. You ate to survive, not for pleasure or display. The sheer monotony of your diet would be hard for us to comprehend. Day in, day out, the same limited range of foods, prepared in the same basic ways. Historians still argue about the exact nutritional adequacy of the average peasant diet. Some suggest that, while monotonous, a diet based on whole grains, legumes, and seasonal vegetables, when available, might have provided sufficient basic nutrients, albeit with seasonal deficiencies, especially in vitamin C. Others point to skeletal evidence showing signs of malnutrition, stunted growth, and high infant mortality as indicators of a more consistently deprived population. The truth likely lies somewhere in between and varied greatly depending on region, local conditions, and the specific time period. One quirky tidbit often cited is the ploughman's lunch, a modern pub meal of bread, cheese, and pickles, which is sometimes romantically linked to the supposed simple, wholesome fare of the medieval laborer. While bread and cheese were indeed staples, the actual daily meal was likely far less appealing and more variable than this neat, modern construction. The visual contrast alone would have been striking. Imagine glimpsing the leftover scraps from a lord's feast, the bones of exotic birds, the remnants of rich pastries, and then returning to your own table with its perpetually refilled bowl of gruel. The sense of injustice, of a divinely ordained, as many believed, but nonetheless galling disparity, must have been profound. It wasn't just that they had more food. They had different food. Food that spoke of a completely different world of flavor, texture, and experience. Your world was one of survival, of making do, of constant calculation about how to stretch what little you had. Theirs was one of relative abundance, albeit with its own peculiar challenges and health consequences. The chasm between the diet of the rich and the poor was just one more stark reminder of the deeply hierarchical and unequal nature of medieval society. You weren't just separated by birth and wealth, but by the very essence of what you put into your stomach each day. We've journeyed through the catalog of culinary challenges, the unappetizing ingredients, the difficult preparations, the lack of variety, and the pervasive threat of scarcity. Now let's consider the inevitable, unpleasant consequence of all these factors: sickness from supper. In medieval times, foodborne diseases were rampant, largely misunderstood, and often deadly. The connection between what you ate and how you felt afterwards was certainly observed, but the precise causes, the invisible bacteria, viruses, and toxins, were unknown. This meant that every meal, especially one involving ingredients of dubious freshness or prepared under less than ideal hygienic conditions, carried a significant risk. Think back to everything we've discussed. The millers potentially adulterating flour with dirt or chalk, leading to digestive upset or long-term issues from ingesting contaminants. The risk of ergotism from rye bread, St. Anthony's fire, causing horrific convulsions, gangrene, and madness. Meat from diseased animals, or meat that had begun to spoil, teeming with bacteria like Salmonella or E. coli, which would lead to violent bouts of vomiting and dysentery. Remember how butchers often slaughtered animals in open streets amidst filth. That's a direct route for contamination. Shellfish harvested from polluted waters could transmit diseases like typhoid. Even water itself, often drawn from contaminated sources, was a primary vehicle for pathogens that caused devastating intestinal illnesses. For you, living in this era, a stomachache wasn't just a minor inconvenience. It could be the first sign of a life-threatening infection. The lack of refrigeration was a constant villain. Food spoiled quickly, especially in warmer months. While preservation methods like salting, smoking, and pickling were employed, they weren't foolproof. Improperly preserved foods could harbor Clostridium botulinum, the bacterium that produces the deadly botulinum toxin, a piece of improperly cured sausage or poorly canned. Though canning as we know it didn't exist, similar principles applied to some forms of potting or sealing. Vegetables could become a lethal meal. The symptoms of botulism, paralysis, difficulty breathing, would have been terrifying and utterly inexplicable. Similarly, toxins produced by molds growing on poorly stored grains or other foods, mycotoxins, could cause a range of illnesses, from acute poisoning to chronic conditions like liver damage, if ingested regularly. You might meticulously scrape the visible mold off your stale bread, but the invisible toxins could have already permeated it. Dairy products, too, were a source of risk. Unpasteurized milk, as we mentioned, could transmit diseases like brucellosis, undulant fever, or tuberculosis if the cow was infected. Cheese, if made with contaminated milk or in unhygienic conditions, could also become a vehicle for harmful bacteria. Your refreshing drink of fresh milk might come with a nasty side effect a few days later. One mainstream historical fact is the devastating impact of diseases like dysentery, often spread through contaminated food and water, particularly in crowded urban environments or among armies on campaign. These illnesses could sweep through populations, causing high mortality, especially among children and the elderly, whose immune systems were more vulnerable. Entire campaigns could be derailed not by enemy action, but by the simple fact that the soldiers' food and water were making them too sick to fight. When illness struck, medical understanding was limited. The prevailing humoral theory attributed disease to imbalances of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Treatments often involve trying to rebalance these humors through methods like bloodletting, purging, or administering concoctions of herbs, some of which might have had some limited effect, while others were useless or even harmful. There was no concept of germ theory, no antibiotics. If you contracted a severe foodborne infection, your body's ability to fight it off, perhaps aided by some folk remedies or prayers, was your only hope. Recovery was uncertain, and death was a common outcome. A quirky tidbit from this era is the existence of leech books or medical texts that sometimes contained advice on what to do for corrupt humors caused by bad food, often suggesting emetics to induce vomiting or purgatives to clear the bowels, effectively trying to expel the offending matter, which, in a way, wasn't entirely illogical. Even if the underlying theory was flawed, historians still argue about the precise contribution of foodborne illness to overall medieval mortality rates compared to other infectious diseases like plague or smallpox. However, it's widely accepted that chronic malnutrition, resulting from the often poor and monotonous diet we've described, would have severely weakened people's immune systems, making them far more susceptible to infections of all kinds, including those transmitted through food. A poorly nourished body simply doesn't have the resources to fight off an aggressive bacterial onslaught. So the poor quality of food and the high risk of foodborne illness were interconnected problems, creating a vicious cycle of malnutrition and disease. Consider the everyday anxiety. You eat a piece of meat that tasted a little off. For the next few days, you're on high alert. Is that twinge in your stomach just indigestion? Or is it the start of something worse? Was the water from the well this morning all right? Or did it have that slightly strange taste again? Children were particularly vulnerable, and parents must have lived in constant fear. Diarrheal diseases, often stemming from contaminated food or water, were a leading cause of infant and child mortality. It's a sobering reality that the simple act of eating, so fundamental to life, was so frequently fraught with danger. You weren't just trying to get enough calories, you were playing a constant, low-stakes or sometimes high-stakes game of Russian roulette with your digestive system. That vague discomfort after a meal. It might just be the medieval miasma of a poorly digested turnip, or it could be something far more sinister brewing in your gut. The modern reassurance of food safety regulations, sell-by dates, and effective medical treatments for infections would have seemed like an unimaginable utopian dream. We've taken quite a journey, haven't we? Down the gritty path of medieval bread, past the risky allure of rare meat, through the monotonous landscape of fasting fare, and into the often unappetizing world of their vegetables and dairy. We've tasted their weak ale, lamented the absence of spice and easy sweetness, cringed at the kitchen calamities and hygiene horror show, understood their preservation predicaments, felt famine's ghostly grip, seen the disparity between noble nosh and peasant plight, and shuddered at the constant threat of sickness from supper. It's clear that food in medieval times, for the vast majority, truly did suck. These lingering bad tastes, however, this era of profound culinary struggle, didn't just fade into history. They profoundly shaped our future food, our attitudes towards it, and the very agricultural and technological innovations that allow us to enjoy the mostly safe, varied, and abundant diet we often take for granted today. The relentless pursuit of food security and palatability over the centuries following the medieval period was a direct response to the hardships we've explored. The drive to improve crop yields, to develop hardier strains of grains and vegetables, was fueled by the collective memory of famine and scarcity. Agricultural innovations like new plow designs, crop rotation systems, building on medieval foundations like the three-field system, and eventually land enclosure and more scientific farming methods, all aim to produce more food, more reliably. You, back in your smoky medieval hut, probably couldn't even dream of the agricultural abundance that would one day feed billions. The ghost of hunger was a powerful motivator for change. The desire for better food preservation led to experimentation and discovery. While salting, smoking, and drying remained staples for a long time, the seeds of future technologies were sown. The eventual understanding of pasteurization by Louis Pasteur in the 19th century, for example, revolutionized dairy safety and extended the shelf life of milk in a way that would have seemed like magic to a medieval peasant struggling with quickly souring milk. Canning, developed in the early 19th century by Nicholas Appert, provided a way to preserve foods for extended periods without the extreme saltiness or toughness of older methods. These weren't just clever inventions. They were solutions to age-old problems that made medieval diners ill or limited their diets so severely. Remember how even the wealthy struggled with spoilage. Future generations found ways to fight back against decay. The spice trade, which was already a powerful economic force in the medieval period, continued to expand and eventually became less exclusive. The age of exploration, partly driven by the desire to find new routes to the spice-producing lands of the East and break existing monopolies, led to the Columbian Exchange. This vast transfer of plants, animals, culture, technology, and ideas between the Old World, Europe, Asia, Africa, and the New World, the Americas, had a monumental impact on global cuisine. Potatoes, tomatoes, maize, corn, chili peppers, vanilla, and cacao staples we can hardly imagine living without today were introduced to Europe, while wheat, grapes, cattle, and pigs, among other things, traveled to the Americas. This dramatically expanded the range of available ingredients, eventually alleviating some of the monotony of the medieval diet, though it took time for these new foods to be widely adopted. The mainstream historical fact is that the Columbian Exchange fundamentally reshaped diets on both sides of the Atlantic. though it also brought devastating diseases to the indigenous populations of the Americas. Even our modern preoccupations with hygiene and food safety have their roots in overcoming the grim realities of the past. The scientific understanding of germs and their role in disease, which emerged in the 19th century, led to public health reforms, improved sanitation, and an emphasis on cleanliness in food preparation that would have been unthinkable in your medieval kitchen. The struggles with foodborne illnesses that plagued your era spurred the development of the very regulations and practices that protect us today. You suffered so that we could, mostly, eat without fear of immediate violent illness. A quirky tidbit, or perhaps a testament to human resilience, is how certain peasant dishes born from scarcity and necessity in medieval times have, ironically, become fashionable or even gourmet items today. Think of rustic breads, certain types of cured meats, or dishes using humble ingredients. Of course, our modern versions are usually made with much better ingredients and under far more hygienic conditions. Historians still argue about the exact pace and regional variations of these dietary changes. The transition from a medieval food mindset, dominated by scarcity and preservation, to a more modern one characterized by relative abundance and a focus on fresh ingredients, was a long and gradual process, not a sudden shift. But the echoes of those bad tastes, the memory of that struggle, are there. The profound human desire for food that is not just sustaining, but also safe, palatable, and varied, is a direct legacy of enduring times when it was often none of those things. So the next time you bite into a crisp apple, savor a fragrant curry, or simply enjoy a glass of clean water, spare a thought for your medieval counterpart, for whom such simple pleasures were often unimaginable luxuries. Their daily grind, their constant battle for decent food, paved the way for the choices and comforts you now enjoy. It's a humbling thought, isn't it? That the very awfulness of their food experience ultimately contributed to the amazing and generally non-lethal food world we inhabit. And so, as we draw this sleepy exploration to a close, and your own thoughts begin to drift towards the quiet of the night, let us carry with us a renewed appreciation for the journey our food has taken through history. The path from that coarse, gritty medieval loaf to the bread on our modern tables, from the suspiciously sourced meat to the carefully regulated produce we find today, has been a long and arduous one. The medieval diner, our spectral companion on this journey, faced daily challenges in sustenance that we can scarcely comprehend, wrestling with scarcity, spoilage, and the constant looming threat of hunger and illness, all with a stoicism born of necessity. Their world, so different from ours, where the quest for basic calories overshadowed almost every other culinary consideration, serves as a poignant reminder of how fortunate we are. The gentle clinking of your own modern kitchen, perhaps the soft hum of your refrigerator keeping things fresh, these are the quiet victories over centuries of struggle. The diverse flavors that grace your palate, the spices from distant lands that you can acquire with such ease, the clean water that flows at your command. These were the stuff of dreams for those who lived and toiled in those earlier, harsher times. Let the memory of their bland pottages and their risky repasts settle lightly in your mind, not as a source of disquiet, but as a gentle nudge towards gratitude. As you relax deeper into your bed, feeling the comfort of your surroundings, allow the story of their food, their resilience, to fade into the soft darkness, a whisper of history easing you towards a peaceful and well-nourished slumber. The anxieties of their daily bread are far removed from your tranquil present. Sleep now, and may your dreams be filled with nothing but sweetness and light.